The morning air was brittle, each breath a quiet cloud suspended briefly before dissolving into the stillness, as if even nature dared not disturb the tension clinging to Foxstone Park. A thin crust of snow stretched across the ground like a blanket trying to hide the secrets buried beneath, while the bare, spindly trees stood in solemn rows like sentinels, frozen in mid-prayer. The park was silent, but for the soft crunch of footsteps, deliberate, slow, almost reverent, as a man approached from the path's edge. His overcoat, charcoal gray, nearly melted into the palette of winter's monochrome. He wore gloves, not for warmth, but for certainty. In his right hand, a slim black garbage bag, ordinary to the point of invisibility. He hesitated for only a second before bending, knees barely creaking, slipping the bag beneath the bench's cold iron ribs. The move was practiced, yet cautious. Not routine, but ritual. A drop. An offering. Then, with the same measured pace, he turned and retraced his steps, never once glancing back. Time ticked on. 15 minutes, maybe 20. A cardinal flashed red for a moment against the snow, then vanished. Then came the second man. Younger, eyes sharp but nervous, the weight of purpose etched across his brow. He approached the bench, pretending, badly, to check his phone, glance at the trees, maybe marvel at the weather. But his body language betrayed him. Too alert, too precise. And when he bent to reach beneath the bench, it all happened at once. 3 men in unmarked jackets emerged from the trees, silent as ghosts. One word barked, "Freeze!" and the park shattered into motion. The second man froze, eyes wide. The bag dropped from his hand. He was surrounded, hands pulled behind him, face pressed into snow. The first man, long gone, was already under surveillance, already marked, already done. This was the signal, the final proof, the last page in a decades-long chapter written in invisible ink. The camera pans now slowly, over the bench, just a bench, its paint chipped, its wood worn by seasons of forgettable conversations and idle pauses. But today, it bore witness, and history, like the cold, settled deep into its cracks. Over the image, a classified document flashes momentarily, redacted lines, a fingerprint, the faded seal of the FBI, before fading into black. Then a voice, calm, measured, unshaken. It was just a bench in a suburban park, but what it saw changed the history of American intelligence. The screen holds the bench a moment longer, snow beginning to fall again, soft as ash. In this quiet suburban corner of Virginia, amidst swing sets and jogging paths, a war had ended. Not with fire, but with silence. Not with bullets, but with betrayal. And the bench, this quiet, indifferent witness, remained. As it always had, as it always would. Fade to black. On-screen text. Foxstone Park, Virginia, February 18, 2001. The music swells, low strings, haunting, reflective, and in the silence that follows, the question begins to take form. How does a man betray everything he's sworn to protect? And why did it take us 22 years to catch him? Robert Philip Hansen was not a man who raised suspicion, and perhaps that was his most dangerous trait. His ability to disappear in plain sight, to bury himself beneath the polished veneer of duty, family, and faith. Born in 1944 in Chicago to a tough, emotionally distant police officer father, young Robert grew up steeped in the rigid codes of authority and discipline, a boy who learned early that silence was safer than defiance, that obedience brought order, even if it didn't bring love. Old black and white photos flicker across the screen. A pale-faced boy in a Catholic school uniform, hands folded tightly in prayer, eyes distant even then, a graduation portrait, his lips pursed like he's holding back something unsayable. The transition to the FBI Academy shows him older, taller, smarter. Always smart, always just outside the inner circle. His instructors praised his technical knowledge, his fastidious attention to detail, his fluency in complex systems, but they noted his social awkwardness, his difficulty connecting. Brilliant but aloof, one had said in a personnel review. He wasn't charismatic, he didn't charm, but he was efficient, he was clean, he was exact. And in the corridors of power that snake through Washington, D.C., where handshake politics and whispered favors often matter more than clean files, Robert Hansen was a ghost, present, necessary, but never invited in. Yet at home, he played the part of the devoted family man. He married Bernadette Bonnie Wack, a deeply religious woman who shared his Catholic convictions. Together they raised 6 children, attended Mass regularly, and practiced Opus Dei, a strict and conservative branch of the Church that demanded discipline, confession, and constant moral reflection. Every day at noon, Hansen paused, wherever he was, to pray. His music of choice? Mozart. Clear, mathematical, controlled. But beneath that ritualistic life, a different rhythm pulsed. Resentment, hunger, a gnawing need to be recognized, to prove that the mind overlooked was the mind that could break nations. He watched as others advanced. Less capable men were promoted. Louder men took credit. Meanwhile, he waited to be noticed, waited to be valued. But the call never came. And so he began to believe something dangerous. That if the world wouldn't value him, he would force it to. He would matter, whether they liked it or not. Over a montage of early FBI ceremonies, American flags, oaths, the buzz of fluorescent lights, audio plays from a whispered confession. It's Hansen's voice, flat but fervent. I've sinned. In thought, in deed, I was proud, I was angry, I wanted more. Cut to footage of him swearing allegiance to the Bureau, his right hand raised, his gaze steady. Then a slow dissolve to the Vatican, bells tolling faintly in the distance. What drives a man who has everything to risk it all for nothing? The narrator asks, and the screen lingers on Hansen's face, caught mid-smile in a family video, a child clinging to his leg. His eyes are unreadable, cold behind wire-framed glasses. The music dips. A quiet thunder brews beneath the frame. A storm is coming. It was an unusually mild January morning in Washington, D.C., the city still dressed in post-holiday inertia, when Robert Hansen stepped off the curb on Wisconsin Avenue, his footsteps firm, his breath visible in soft puffs that vanished almost as quickly as his certainty would harden. He didn't fidget, didn't hesitate. He crossed the short distance to the Soviet embassy, with the same calm he applied to morning prayers, like a man arriving not to betray his country, but to fulfill a long-delayed appointment with fate. No wig, no sunglasses, no costume. Just the bland confidence of a middle-aged civil servant in a wool coat who knew the value of looking ordinary. Behind the embassy's iron gate, the red flag of the USSR fluttered weakly in the winter breeze, as though it too were reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. Inside, security guards straightened, their training whispering that this was out of protocol. Americans didn't just walk in uninvited, not like this, but Hansen had no fear. What he carried in his briefcase would buy him not just money, but relevance, power, a perverse sort of respect. He asked to speak to someone in authority. When the consul officer finally received him in a dim back room, more out of curiosity than protocol, Hansen was methodical, polite. He placed an envelope on the table, manila, creased, unassuming, and with it, his country's blood. Inside were names, codes, technical documents, the identity of Soviet agents working undercover for the FBI and CIA. Assets the United States had cultivated with years of careful diplomacy, money, and risk. It was enough to shift the balance of trust in the intelligence war, enough to kill. The Soviet officer's eyes narrowed, mouth tight, fingers skimming the papers like a man handling explosives, because in a way, that's what they were. Hansen offered no name, no address, no desire to meet again in person. He didn't want drama. He wanted an arrangement, clean, compartmentalized, quiet, drops, dead letters, signals. No face-to-face, he told them. No photographs, no identification. I expect payments in cash, small bills, no surveillance. The KGB officer, trained to spot desperation, saw something far colder. Not a man coerced by ideology or fear, but one lured by the dark thrill of control. A man playing God in the shadows. Hansen even refused a code name. An ego move, paradoxically, that gave him more mystique. He was the invisible traitor, the ghost in the machine. When he left, he didn't look back. The documents he had left behind would result in arrests, interrogations, executions. Men would be tortured. Trust would collapse. But as he blended back into the gray current of American life, he felt nothing. Just a quiet elation, sharp and glittering, like ice cracking in spring. It had begun. He wasn't just a cog in the Bureau's machinery anymore. He was the saboteur, the man with the match, the man who knew what the gears really ground down. And in that knowledge, he felt alive. Alive in a way prayer had never granted him. Alive in a way only betrayal could satisfy. Through the fluorescent-lit corridors of the J. Edgar Hoover building, time moved with a bureaucrat's rhythm. Paper shuffled, phones clicked into cradles, coffee cooled in styrofoam cups. And within that machinery, Robert Hansen became something less than a man, and more like a presence. A ghost threaded through the fabric of an institution built on suspicion, yet somehow blind to its most dangerous inhabitant. From the early 1980s through the late 1990s, while the Cold War collapsed, evolved, and contorted into new digital battlefields, Hansen operated in quiet defiance of every oath he had sworn, drip-feeding the Soviets and later the Russians a hemorrhage of American secrets so devastating in their scope that their damage remains partly unknown, hidden beneath layers of classification and shame. He gave them the names of double agents, the blueprints of nuclear strategies, satellite reconnaissance protocols, surveillance capabilities, and even the location of a secret tunnel the U.S. had burrowed beneath the Soviet embassy in D.C. A decades-long espionage marvel rendered worthless in a single act of treachery. And still, the Bureau had no scent, no shadow. Hansen encrypted his communications with mathematical elegance, left his dead drops precisely timed and mapped, masked his true intentions with such sterile discipline that even within his own mind, the sin felt procedural. He used aliases, Ramon Garcia, B., but never stepped out of the skin of Robert Hansen, the awkward but devout family man, the quiet agent who quoted scripture and corrected colleagues with arrogant precision, who found comfort in Mass and Mozart, while his treason bled silently into the veins of two governments. His betrayals weren't impulsive. They were cold calculations, like clockwork surgery, removing vital organs from the American intelligence apparatus without leaving fingerprints. Colleagues described him as standoffish, brilliant, sometimes abrasive, but never dangerous. He was too dull, too weird, too devout. And that miscalculation, that underestimation, became his camouflage. While others chased ghosts, Hansen stood in the open, cloaked in the banality of familiarity. Over the years, American agents in Moscow were arrested in clusters, interrogated, executed. Missions went dark. Programs collapsed. And every time the Bureau turned inward, asking who could be leaking, Hansen slipped by unnoticed, watching investigations bend toward others, enjoying the cruel theater of it all. He even participated in mole hunts, offering theories, suggestions, always just enough to muddy the waters, never enough to raise eyebrows. Surveillance footage from the era shows the dull grind of office life. File cabinets yawning open, stacks of folders marked "Top Secret," clocks ticking above agents who had no idea that time, for some of them, had already run out. In a house of mirrors, the narrator murmurs, the most dangerous man is the one who casts no reflection. Hansen didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply existed. A still point in a churning war, a shadow that passed through walls. And as the Cold War cooled into diplomacy, as Russia's flags changed but its methods didn't, the damage he inflicted only deepened, because no one was looking for the quiet man in the pew or the father coaching Little League. No one was looking at the ghost. The graves appear first. Wide shot, winter light, marble stones standing like mute sentinels, before the camera drifts closer, revealing names that most Americans never learned, faces that flicker briefly on screen before dissolving into the grainy static of forgotten history. Valery Martinov, calm-eyed and resolute, a former KGB officer who had risked everything to help the United States. Boris Yuzhin, sharp-featured, a man who believed that truth was worth crossing borders for. And Dmitry Polyakov, the legendary GRU general whose courage had fed Washington some of the most consequential intelligence of the Cold War, and whose death would become a symbol of betrayal echoing across decades. They were allies, informants, patriots in the shadows, and thanks to Hansen, they were fed, one by one, to the wolves. As the montage shifts, we see their families, wives who keep photographs in cracked frames, sons who speak softly, still unsure whether their fathers died bravely or quietly in the night. Daughters who confess, in halting words, that they learned only years later what role their fathers had played in the violent ballet of superpowers. There is no melodrama in their voices, just a heaviness that sinks deep into the air, as if grief itself has become a permanent resident of their homes. A woman's hands tremble as she straightens a medal pinned to a uniform jacket preserved in a glass case. Another stares at a letter her husband sent the year before he vanished, its corners worn by decades of rereading. The documentary cuts to archival photographs. Martinov standing near a radio set, his expression focused, unaware that Hansen had already signed his death sentence. Yuzhin smiling beside an American contact, his future already shrinking. Polyakov in full dress uniform, medals glittering under studio lights, the image freezing just as the narrator speaks his name, as though even time hesitates to move beyond that final moment of dignity. Redacted files appear next, black bars obscuring truths the government still refuses to unearth fully, flickering across the screen like the heartbeat of a system that failed the very people who risked themselves for it. In the margins of one report, a typewritten note reads, "Compromised as of," before the text is swallowed by censorship. Another document lists dates of arrests in Moscow, cold, chronological, unemotional, yet the silence between each line screams. "What happened to them?" the narrator asks, voice low, deliberate. "We know. We don't need details." The Cold War had its own vocabulary for erasing men. Polyakov was shot. Martinov was interrogated, then likely executed. Yuzhin survived, but barely, carrying scars no camera could record. Their stories are not footnotes. They are casualties, the human cost of one man's hunger for relevance. The frame returns to their faces, one more flicker, one brief resurrection, before fading again, as if the documentary itself cannot bear to hold them for too long. And over the fading montage, the ticking clock begins once more, steady, merciless, reminding us that while Langley in the mid-1990s was no longer the cathedral of certainty it once claimed to be. It was a fractured hive, buzzing with unease, its foundations quietly rotting beneath the polished floors and mirrored offices where silence had become the new dialect of survival. There was no single moment the fear began, no explosion, no memo, no smoking gun, but rather a creeping dread, a sense that something vital had been leaking from within, slowly, invisibly, and with devastating precision. Operations that had once been reliable were suddenly collapsing. Assets overseas were vanishing, contacts were going dark, and in Moscow, trusted informants were being arrested at an alarming rate, sometimes just days after meetings. The facts were undeniable, but the implications were paralyzing. There was a mole, somewhere, someone, but no one knew who. And so suspicion metastasized. Every file became a liability, every conversation a potential trap. Shredders hummed like insects in dark rooms late into the night, devouring paper trails that might one day be used as ammunition. Interagency trust, once frayed, now split entirely. CIA blamed the FBI, and the Bureau suspected the agency, while both turned inward with the sharpness of old rivals desperate to save face. In offices where laughter once accompanied coffee, there was now only silence, interrupted by the slow closing of doors, the shifting of blinds, the clink of metal as file cabinets were double-locked. Agents passed each other in hallways with narrowed eyes, their greetings shortened, clipped, or skipped altogether. Phone calls went unanswered. Friends became interrogators. Whole departments were quietly reassigned, isolated, as though physical distance might halt the spread of whatever sickness had burrowed into the intelligence community's bones. Glass office reflections showed men staring at themselves longer than necessary, as if searching for signs of guilt or deception in their own features. Paranoia was no longer a liability. It was policy. Task forces formed in secret rooms, classified within classified, hunting for the mole like a phantom buried in a graveyard of dead leads and outdated assumptions. The smallest inconsistencies were catalogued. Who had access to what file? Who took a sick day? Who lingered too long in the server room? Careers began to erode under the weight of implication. Reputations shattered on whispers alone. The enemy wasn't at the gate, the narrator intones over a slow zoom through a dimly lit corridor lined with sealed doors. He was inside the walls. And worse, he was watching. He knew their systems, their blind spots, their habits. He understood how their internal processes would tear themselves apart. The mole, whoever he was not just leaking information. He was orchestrating a symphony of collapse, slow and methodical, turning the guardians of American secrets into suspects of their own mission. As the camera pans across a corkboard, crowded with red string and faded photos, a coffee mug trembles slightly from the vibration of a nearby shredder, and the screen fades to black, the only sound remaining a faint ticking. Steady, unnerving, inevitable. The war, they realized too late, wasn't over. It had just changed uniforms. In the hushed inner sanctums of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, 1999 did not arrive with a bang, but with a deepening silence, an oppressive, breath-holding quiet that stretched across the faces of senior agents summoned to an unmarked room, where blinds were already drawn and cell phones were left at the door. The operation was codenamed Gray Day, a name chosen not for its poetry, but for its ambiguity. This was no longer about Cold War ideologies or binary lines between enemy and patriot. This was about rot, gray, and indistinct, threading its way through the veins of the nation's most secretive systems. The elite task force assembled in that room understood the stakes. Someone inside the intelligence community had been betraying the United States for years, maybe decades, feeding secrets to Moscow with such surgical precision that dozens of assets had died, entire operations had collapsed, and entire generations of intelligence infrastructure had been compromised. Their first assumption, logical but tragically misdirected, was that the mole had to be inside the CIA. It made sense. The disappearances, the leaks, the operational failures, they pointed, or so it seemed, toward Langley. And that was exactly what Hansen wanted. From his nondescript office back at FBI headquarters, where he quietly monitored internal computer activity and performed security audits under the protective cloak of seniority, Hansen watched the CIA turn inward and eat itself alive, while the Gray Day team began digging in all the wrong places. Days turned to weeks, and leads turned to dead ends. Files were reopened, agents interrogated. Suspicion fell on a CIA officer named Brian Kelly, a man whose every movement began to be shadowed, whose every communication was dissected, whose life began to fray under the crushing suspicion of betrayal, while the real mole sat in the room next door, occasionally offering his own insights on the case, smiling faintly to himself as misdirection took root. And then everything changed. In the spring of 2000, a crack opened. A file, an ex-KGB dossier, smuggled out of Russia by a trusted source, landed in the hands of U.S. intelligence. It was raw, fragile, nearly incomplete. But inside was a sliver of salvation. A garbage bag, a location, a code name, and, most crucially, a fingerprint preserved in bureaucratic amber. The moment that print was cross-referenced, time seemed to halt. The screen shows the slow-motion match process. White-on-black interface, databases whirring, the ridges aligning piece by piece. Then, a full match. Robert Hansen. The silence that followed was total. The room did not gasp. No one spoke. It was as if oxygen itself had vanished from the room. Then, a single heartbeat, low and distant, like the start of a drumbeat before a march. Hansen, the loyal Catholic, the Mozart-loving father of 6, the veteran FBI agent, was the mole. The ghost had a face now. And worse, he had been sitting inside the very agency tasked with protecting the Republic. For 22 years, he had watched them chase shadows, and now, for the first time, the shadow stared back. The hunt was over. The reckoning had just begun. The air was sharp and brittle on the morning of February 18, 2001, the kind of morning where the sky hangs low and pale, as if holding its breath alongside the men who waited in silence among the skeletal trees of Foxstone Park, their radios hushed, their breath fogging in controlled bursts. Robert Hansen drove into the park lot with his usual composure, unaware that the car he'd carefully chosen for its anonymity now pulsed with a hidden tracker tucked into its undercarriage, its signals whispering every turn and stop to a satellite, and then down to the FBI command post less than a mile away. He had chosen the site, like all his drops, for its quiet banality. A patch of suburbia nestled in Vienna, Virginia, where mothers pushed strollers, joggers listened to Walkmans, and no one questioned a man alone on a bench in the early morning. But this time, as Hansen stepped out of his vehicle, navy coat zipped to the chin, black gloves gripping the plastic garbage bag filled with yet another trove of classified material, there were eyes on him. Dozens of them, hidden behind pine trees, seated in parked sedans, perched on rooftops with long-range lenses. He didn't notice. He moved with the slow, deliberate precision of a man fulfilling ritual, not committing treason, approaching the same bench he'd used before, nestled in shadow and framed by frost-covered brush. He crouched slightly, knees protesting, and placed the bag beneath the bench, fingers brushing the iron leg that had seen this act before. He lingered for a moment. Not long, but long enough for the agents watching to recognize it as the final act of a man who still believed he was untouchable. And then he turned, casually, no rush in his step, walking back toward his car, unaware that the net had already closed. The agents moved in silently at first, a ghost tide converging. Then, in one fluid motion, they were on him. "FBI, don't move!" echoed through the crisp air as Hansen froze, stunned but not panicked, perhaps finally understanding, not just that the game was over, but that the board had been rigged for months. He didn't run, didn't speak. As they brought him down, his glasses, a staple of his forgettable facade, slipped from his face and landed softly in the snow, lenses fogging slightly from the warmth of his breath. The cameras caught everything. The tilt of his head as he looked up at the agents, as if to ask whether this moment, this betrayal, was real. The slight curl of his lip that might have been disgust, or resignation, or, some say, relief. For 22 years, the narrator whispers as the scene slows to a cinematic crawl, he evaded the truth. But the truth was waiting, just beneath the wood and iron of a lonely bench. The screen lingers on the now empty bench, snowflakes beginning to fall again, erasing footsteps, burying the past. And in that quiet suburban park, history closed its jaws, not with gunfire, not with shouting, but with the soft snap of cuffs and the final silence of a man undone. The fluorescent lights in the Federal Detention Center buzzed with a low, indifferent hum, their sterile glow casting long, thin shadows across the concrete floor where Robert Hansen now walked in slow, measured steps, his feet shackled, his wrists cuffed, the rhythm of his movement no longer dictated by ritual or secrecy, but by the cold mechanics of incarceration. After his arrest, he said little. Nothing of substance. Nothing that could offer clarity or catharsis to the nation he'd betrayed or the colleagues he'd outmaneuvered. During debriefings, he answered only what was required, admitting to his treason with a chilling detachment, outlining the methods, the drops, the dead agents like a man explaining a chess game already concluded. There was no apology, no tremor in his voice, no flash of guilt. When asked why, truly why, he had done it, he dismissed the question with a shrug or a half-answer, murmuring vaguely about frustration, injustice, being undervalued, misunderstood. But there was no manifesto, no great ideological revelation, just a void, a vacuum where purpose might have been. He pled guilty to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy in July 2001, a decision that spared him the death penalty but condemned him to something far colder, a life in ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, where the world outside is reduced to a sliver of sky glimpsed through a steel-meshed slit, and the only voice one hears regularly is one's own. Solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in a concrete cell measuring 7 by 12 feet, where the silence is not peaceful but oppressive, a slow erosion of the self. Hansen is now prisoner number 48551-083, stripped of name, status, and legacy. No visitors, no contact, no more secrets to sell. His Bible remains on the shelf, its pages well worn, its words now recited not in pious solitude but in self-imposed penance. The same man who once played God with the fates of others now finds himself forgotten, a ghost again. But this time, locked away from history's stage. The Bureau never truly got their full answer. What they uncovered was only the architecture of betrayal, not the soul behind it. Perhaps that, too, was part of Hansen's final act of control. To deny closure, to deny explanation, to force those he'd wounded to live not just with the damage, but with the unknowing. He wanted recognition, the narrator murmurs over a slow shot of the prison's razor-wire fences slicing into the sky. He got infamy. He wanted silence. He got history. The camera drifts down a long corridor lined with thick steel doors, each identical, each final. At the end, Hansen's cell, its windowless walls bathed in a gray light that never changes. As the door closes behind him, the sound is heavy, metallic, echoing like a tomb sealed for eternity. There is no music now, just the sound of nothing. And in that nothing, the legacy of one of the most destructive spies in American history lies still, unrepentant, unreadable, and irreversibly entombed. Fade to black. The bench still sits there, unremarkable, untouched by time but weathered by it, its iron frame rusted at the corners, its wooden slats faded to a dull gray, blending seamlessly into the quiet contours of Foxstone Park, a place where dogs bark in the distance, joggers puff along winding paths, and children laugh without knowing that beneath the soil and snow and roots, history once pulsed with betrayal. There are no plaques, no cautionary signs, no silent guards posted at its edges. Just a bench, like any other, except that it bore witness to the unraveling of a nation's deepest confidences, and to the final act of a man who, for 22 years, eroded from within what armies and empires had failed to break from without. The grass grows wild now around its legs in summer, and in winter, snow gathers gently on its back like ash, as if nature itself insists on laying a quiet shroud over what once happened there. People pass it every day, some pausing to rest, others walking by without a glance, unaware that this was once the stage for the conclusion of the longest, most damaging betrayal in American intelligence history. No bullets were fired, no bodies lay bleeding, no sirens wailed. And yet, from that very spot, the silence screamed. Secrets, once classified and buried in locked vaults beneath concrete and oath, were handed off in cheap trash bags beneath this very bench, and with them, lives were lost, operations were crippled, and trust, both foreign and domestic, was shattered. The real danger, the true weapon, was not an explosive or a missile, but a choice, a single man's decision to be seen, to be significant, to be feared and known and powerful, even if only in shadow. It wasn't guns or bombs or warheads that shook the intelligence world, the narrator murmurs as the camera holds on the bench, now empty, framed by branches gently swaying in the breeze. It was one man's choice and one park bench. The final shots are slow and reverent. The bench under dusk's fading light, a crow landing briefly on its edge before taking off again, the wind brushing dried leaves across the path like paper once read, then discarded. There is no resolution here, no triumphant music or speech of redemption, just the sobering knowledge that betrayal doesn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrives dressed in ordinariness, cloaked in prayer, smiling across dinner tables, raising children, attending church, filing reports, playing Mozart at night. And in that truth lies the horror, that evil, when methodical and quiet, when patient and precise, becomes indistinguishable from the mundane. Fade out. A soft wind stirs the trees. Snow begins to fall again. Then, against the black screen, in stark white text, the final words appear. The traitor is the poison in the bloodstream, invisible, silent, lethal. The music is faint now. just a single, drawn-out note as the screen fades to silence. The bench remains always. If you like these kinds of stories, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. We would really appreciate it.